Alchemy is one of the most intriguing, but at the same time, one of the most difficult to understand topics in the history of science. Alchemy is going to be the first topic that we cover in this lecture. Actually, there are going to be three topics that I cover. First, alchemy. Then, second, a curious division between rival groups of intellectuals in the Islamic world and the very unusual matter theory of one of them. And then finally, since this is the last lecture that I can devote to the Islamic world, we have to talk about the difficult and hard to answer question about the decline and the causes of the decline of Islamic culture, which was in evidence by the end of the 12th century. Well, let's start with alchemy then. There are two aspects I want to talk about. First, its origin outside of the Islamic Empire, that is, in Hellenistic Egypt, in the first few centuries of the Christian era, and then its development into a full-fledged part of natural philosophy in Arabic culture. All right, well, let's start with the background. The background for alchemy, for chemistry, starts about the 3rd century A.D. in Alexandria, the area around Alexandria in Hellenistic Egypt. The Greek word chemia at that time was used to describe a group of processes mostly for the refining, the purification of metals, the making of alloys, the making of artificial gems, and the making of mimics, alloys that mimicked gold and silver. Now, the word chemia seems to come from the Greek verb cheo, which means to melt or to smelt or to cast. So clearly the origins of alchemy, the origins of chemistry, come from this metalworking tradition. What's unfortunate is that very, very little survives from these early Greek texts. We have some scraps of papyrus, we have some more or less corrupt texts from writers like Zosimus, who was a 4th century writer. But it's very difficult to get a clear sense of what was going on in this first phase of alchemy in Hellenistic Egypt. What is clear, however, is that by the time chemistry, chemia, was transferred to the Arab world, the practitioners were no longer interested in making just artificial, look-alike ersatz gold and silver, but actually real gold and silver from cheaper metals by the process known as transmutation. Well, the Islamic world took up Greek texts on alchemy during the translation movement in the 9th century, but soon, certainly by the end of the 9th century, they were starting to do their own chemical experimentation and theorization. There is one story that's told about the Caliph al-Mansur, the founder of Baghdad, that in the late 8th century he heard about alchemy from one of his secretaries who had traveled to the court of Constantine V, the then reigning emperor of the Byzantine Empire, and that this secretary saw at the emperor's court a transmutation of base metals into gold. Now, clearly, something like this would be something that would get the attention of a reigning caliph, monarch, king, prince, whatever. The ability to make gold naturally has certain practical advantages. Well, let's talk about alchemy in the Islamic world. The term alchemy, notice there is the letter al at the beginning again. It is an Arabic word. It's the Arabic article al plus the Greek chemia. That's where the word comes from. And in the Islamic world, this term, alchemia in Arabic, dealt with the study, the treatment, the refining, and the production of specific material substances. Now, just like in astronomy today, we see some remnants of Arabic astronomy, in chemistry today, we can see some remnants of Arabic alchemy. So words like alcohol and alkali and alum are all words that come out of the Islamic Middle Ages, from the Arabic contributions. One of the places for contribution was in the improvement of the practical processes of dealing with material substances. This is something that's special about alchemy or chemistry, that it's intimately related with how human beings deal with material substances. How do we do crystallizations and distillations and sublimations? And how do we work with these substances? Well, part of the Arabic contribution was the devising of improved methods and improved instruments for carrying out things like distillation and crystallization. They improved upon the rudimentary methods that were first devised in Hellenistic Egypt. One of the ways they were able to improve was, again, through a technological substance, a technological ability that was preserved in the Islamic world, namely glass blowing. This nearly died out in the West. The West was not able to make glass. It was made very much in the Roman period, but glass making was not practiced very much in the Latin West until the late Middle Ages. In the Islamic world, however, glass production, glass blowing had reached quite a high level of development. Well, let's talk about describing material substances. If the Islamic Empire is spread out all over a huge swath of territory, there are all kinds of stones and minerals and metals and herbs and various sorts of things that need cataloging. And so catalogs of these were developed in the Arabic world. One of these comes from Ar-Razi, a Persian physician and chemist who was born about 865, died in 925. He's sometimes called the Arab Galen because of his contributions to medicine. He wrote books on fevers and on anatomy and on drugs. And in connection with his work at a hospital that he managed, he was interested in the chemical preparation of various substances, presumably because they could be used medicinally. One of his most important works is the Kitabul Asrar, or the Book of Secrets. This was translated eventually into Latin and became an important part of the corpus of Latin alchemy in the Middle Ages in Europe. Well, besides these practical aspects, we should go to theory now, alchemical or chemical theory. Most important theory is attached to the name of Jabir ibn Hayyan. It's called the mercury-sulfur theory. Let me say something first about Jabir ibn Hayyan. There may at one time have been a person by this name. There may not have been a person by this name. What we do know is that there are about 2,000 books that are attributed, or were attributed at one point, many of them are lost now, to this one character. Either he lived a very long time or he was very prolific. Well, actually neither one of those, because the works were written over about a 150-year period, and they're actually the productions of a Shiite sect that put the name of their founder on basically everything that they wrote. Well, let's look at the theory. The mercury-sulfur theory tries to explain the origin of the metals and why the metals have so many properties in common. They're all shiny, they're all hard, they're fusible, they're able to be hammered and beaten. The mercury-sulfur theory states that all metals are made out of two substances, which Jabir ibn Hayyan, whoever he is, calls mercury and sulfur. This was an outgrowth, a development of an idea that Aristotle promoted in his book on the meteors. He says that underneath the ground, two fumes arise from the center of the earth. One is dry and smoky, one is wet and vaporous. Jabir ibn Hayyan calls the smoky one sulfur and the wet one mercury. They condense underground and combine, and from that we get the metals. When the mercury and sulfur are very pure and in just the right proportion, we get the best metal of all, gold. But when there's too much of one or the other, we get one of the baser metals. Now notice what this does. This theoretically undergirds the possibility of transmutation. Because if all the metals are made out of the same two substances and differ only in proportion and purity of those two ingredients, all you need to do to turn lead into gold is purify the ingredients and get their relative proportions right. So there's a theoretical underpinning for transmutation. Sometimes moderns like to scoff at this long-term search for the secret of transmutation, but really there's a theory that undergirds it. We have a different theory that doesn't, but nonetheless. Transmutation, how is it carried out? Well, supposedly it was supposed to be carried out by a prepared substance that you made in a vessel. And this substance was called by the Hellenistic alchemists the philosopher's stone. It was also called xere. Now, xere is literally a powder that you put on a wound to heal it, a medicinal powder. This xere, apparently, is also a powder that you could put, or this philosopher's stone, also called xere, could be put on a metal, and in a few minutes it would transmute it from a base metal into gold, in a sense healing it the way a medicinal xere would heal a wound. The Arabic transliteration of that word xere is iksir, and if you add the Arabic article, you get al-iksir, which is the origin of our word elixir, which is a word we still use to talk about a medicine with great potent characteristics. Well, alchemists in the Islamic world, as well as in the later Latin world, endeavored to prepare this secret substance, the philosopher's stone. The Islamic mercury-sulfur theory promoted by the Jabirian corpus was the foundation of chemical theory in one way or another for the next 800 years. Down until about 1700, there were still developments of the Jabirian mercury-sulfur theory, these two elements that make up the metals and or of other things as well. These ideas were still being promoted in Europe, so it had a very long lifespan. It was very influential. Another important writer I should mention on alchemy is Ibn Sina, known to the Latins as Avicenna. He's 10th and 11th century, born about 980 and dies in 1037. He, like Al-Razi, is Persian, and again, like Al-Razi, was a physician. He wrote a huge book called Al-Qanun, the Canon, about medicine. It's an immense text. It was a compilation of medical knowledge and techniques. After it reached Europe, it was considered authoritative there as a work on medicine until the 17th century, and was printed actually in Arabic in Europe, in fact, not only in translation. In terms of alchemy, Avicenna also wrote a book called the Kitabu Shafa, which is the Book of the Remedy. It adopted the Jabirian mercury-sulfur theory, but at the same time denied, on the basis of Aristotle, the possibility of transmutation. So when Arabic alchemy comes into the Latin West, which we'll see later on, it comes in two different strands. It comes in, first of all, the sort of Jabirian ideas promoting transmutation, looking for the philosopher's stone, the elixir, and also this Avicennian branch that says, well, no, transmutation is not possible. And so right from the very beginning, when alchemy gets into Europe, there is dissension within it. We'll talk about that much more later. Now let me move from the topic of alchemy, but still staying on the topic of matter theory, to talk about two rival groups that coexisted within the Islamic world. This is very interesting, and we wish we knew more about these two groups. One group, the one that we know more about, are called the Falasifa. Now, Falasifa, this is just, if you listen to it carefully, it's philosophers. It's just a transliteration of the Greek. The Falasifa considered themselves to be the true heirs and advancers of Greek natural philosophy and Greek thought. Their commitments were generally to Plato, Neoplatonism, and a sort of Platonic reading of Aristotle. Their opponents, or their rivals at least, were called the Mutakallimun. The Mutakallimun were the practitioners of what was called kalam. Now, kalam literally in Arabic means discourse or speech. What it is Islamic speculative theology. It's a matter of discussing. In the Islamic world, the tradition of theology is deeply oral, as it is, for example, in the Jewish tradition. It's an oral tradition. And so kalam, this discussion, is the discussion of theology. Now, although kalam was predominantly theological in character, it also dealt with such issues as epistemology and ontology and logic, but more interestingly, also with physical theories of matter and cosmology. How peculiar. Well, in fact, matter theory became one of the major points of contention for the Mutakallimun. What was their matter theory? Well, it's very unusual and very different from that of the Falasifa. In the 9th and 10th century, and probably earlier, their ideas were radically atomistic. That's strange, because I've already told you that Epicurean atomism was rejected by both Christians and Muslims in general because of its tendencies toward atheism. But the Mutakalimun seem to have picked up some ideas of Epicureanism. How radically atomistic was it? Well, they not only believed that matter came in discrete, smallest parts, but also believed that time was not continuous, but came in discrete, smallest parts, as well as space, as well as motion. All of these came in discrete parts. What they seem to be adopting is a radically non-Euclidean view of space. For Euclid, his whole geometry depends upon the idea that there is a continuity of a line, that a line is not made up of discrete points. Put as many points together as you want, you never get a line. The Mutakalimun, on the other hand, seem to be using what we call a discrete geometry, where points actually do add up to something. Where on earth did they get this from, and why? Well, both of those questions are difficult to answer because the earliest writings of the Mutakalimun are lost. So we only have digests of them from later writers. There is, however, no evidence that any writings of Epicurus were ever translated into Arabic. There's no evidence that any legitimately Epicurean, much less Lucretian works were read by Islamic theologians. What may have happened instead was that they got sort of a digested version of this from interactions maybe with Nestorian Christians who would have been familiar with the natural philosophical ideas of the Hellenistic world, but we really just don't know. Why did they adopt it? Well, that also is unclear. There has been the suggestion made that it was adopted for a specific theological purpose, namely to confound the dualists. Now, the dualist I mentioned once before very briefly when we were talking about Augustine. The dualist believed in two forces in the universe, two gods, a good one and an evil one, and generally believed, particularly in the Manichaean version of dualism, that matter was inherently evil. Now, the idea of matter being inherently evil is not consonant with either Christianity or Islam, because God created matter, and what God creates is good. The dualists would have been a problem for the early Muslims, especially once the capital was moved to Baghdad, because now where were they? They were in the middle of Mesopotamia, which is the origin of dualist philosophies. The Persians were certainly dualists at one time. Therefore, if you want to say something about matter not being evil, you need to know something about matter. This is how the argument goes. Know something about matter, you need a matter theory, and the Mutakalimun seem to have picked up this discrete geometry and this atomistic view of matter. What I want to emphasize to you, though, is that if this origin is actually true, what does it mean? It means that a theological need, a need on the part of theologians, actually was the cause for the adoption of a specific scientific conception of the world. That is not a usual connection that moderns tend to make. But this, I promise you, will not be the only example we see of this. Once we get to the Latin Middle Ages, there'll be a lot more. It also, the Mutakalimun and the Falasifa also idealize or typify two different ways in which scientific knowledge can be transmitted between cultures. The Falasifa actually had the books of the Greeks. They were actually in that tradition. They read the exact words, at least in Arabic, of Greek natural philosophers. But if you think about it, that's not the only way we learn. When we want to learn about astronomy, we don't necessarily read the latest papers in the Astrophysical Journal. We don't necessarily read the cutting edge part of science. We tend to read popularizations, or we tend to pick up things sort of just from the culture in general. In our culture, so many scientific ideas are built into it that we know a lot of science that we take for granted that we don't actually know where it comes from. Something like this, it's been suggested, was what happened with the Mutakalimun. They, as well, picked up some of the basics of an Epicurean atomism, divorced from the atheistic bad parts of it that made Epicureanism so distasteful to so many people, but picked it up from some source, maybe not necessarily a popularization, but maybe from speculations going on in the Christian communities who were familiar with Greek texts. Maybe not. We don't know. This is, of course, the problem that we always run up against until we get to the modern age, that the texts we really want to have, we don't necessarily have. It would be lovely to have early texts from the Mutakalimun. Don't necessarily have them. Maybe they're out there somewhere and we don't know about them. Well, having said this now, we need to go to a sad chapter in Islamic history, a sad chapter in Islamic culture, and that is the decline that occurred in Islamic civilization, evident by the beginning of the 13th century. By, say, 1500, there was really very little scientific work going on in the Islamic world. And that's a problem that needs to be explained. It's, in fact, one of the big questions, one of the great mysteries in the history of science. What happened in the Islamic world? And there are a lot of theories. And for the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to try to present you with some of those theories. But remember that all of these are tentative. I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture that there's so much work left to be done on this topic. There are texts in Arabic scattered, for example, throughout Europe in libraries where not necessarily anyone reads Arabic. We don't even know what's there. There are presumably Arabic texts throughout the Arab-speaking world that also we're not terribly familiar with yet. So there's plenty of work to be done there. History of science is thinly populated as a realm. On the one hand, we can point to external factors, that is external to the history of science itself, in the culture of Islam. The unity of the Islamic world by the 12th century was falling apart. No longer was there a clear central authority. There were more and more civil, more and more examples of civil strife breaking out, more and more local princes and leaders wanting to be more independent. Moreover, problems came from the outside. It turns out that the decline of Islamic civilization corresponds pretty well with the rise of the Latin West. And in fact, the Latin West started bringing armies now against Islamic lands. In the late 11th century, the Muslims lost most of Spain, much of Spain, all of Sicily, and remember at the end of the 11th century was the First Crusade, which captured Jerusalem, captured most of the Levant from the Islamic Empire in 1099 and set up a Latin kingdom of Jerusalem that lasted for 150 years. But it wasn't just from the West that things started eating away at the Islamic Empire. From the East as well, the Mongols were reaching their zenith at about this point and were starting to invade the Islamic world from the East. The most horrid moment of this, at least for a Muslim, would have been in 1258 when the Mongol hordes overran Baghdad and sacked it. Much of the city was destroyed in that. This is one of those moments of incalculable loss for Western civilization that we can't even begin to fathom. For 500 years, Baghdad was the glittering cosmopolitan capital of the intellectual world. In 1258, it's sacked. Its libraries dispersed. The story that is told by one Arab historian was that the Mongols, whether this is true or not, we don't know, but this is what one Arab historian says, that the Mongols threw the books of the library into the Tigris, and that there were so many books that the river ran black with ink for 3 days. No doubt an exaggeration, but it expresses the sense of horror of what this sacking of Baghdad, the end of the Abbasid dynasty, meant to the Islamic intellectual and cultural world. Now, on the other hand, a historian might well argue that such signs were not the cause of decay, but rather just signs of decay, that the Islamic Empire had weakened and allowed these military losses. So whether or not it's a cause or an effect, we're not actually sure. There were certain intellectual reasons as well. One theory points to dissension between the Mutakallimun and the Falasifa, that the claim goes something like this, that the Mutakallimun were conservative Islamic theologians who increasingly viewed the kind of work that the Falasifa did as foreign, un-Islamic, alien. According to this model, victory over the Falasifa by the Mutakallimun undercut the development of Islamic natural philosophical thought. Well, that might be the case. Many people point to the 12th century theologian Al-Ghazali, who certainly had a very strong negative reaction to thought that came from the Greek world, from the non-Islamic world. Yet, not everyone is convinced by this. Al-Ghazali should not be allowed to speak for the totality of Islamic thought in the 12th century. No more than Tertullian should be allowed to speak for Christian responses to Greek knowledge in the 2nd century. Moreover, there were plenty of Mutakallimun that seemingly did not have a clear opposition to Greek thought. They adopted intellectual systems, sometimes not quite knowing where they're coming from, but nonetheless, Greek thought was already incorporated with Islamic theology from an early point. Remember, the translation movement occurred early, 300 years, 400 years earlier. How foreign could assimilated knowledge be after 400 years of being in the Islamic world? Is it still foreign at that point? So maybe that argument is not the best solution either. Maybe part of it, but it's certainly not the whole thing. One related issue, which I find very interesting, but again may explain only a portion of the decline rather than the whole decline, is this: that the rise in occasionalist thinking may have had a bad effect on Islamic science. Now, what do I mean by occasionalist thinking? Occasionalism is this, that God keeps the world functioning at every moment. The idea works something like this for the Mutakallimun with a discrete atomistic philosophy. Let's say we have a body moving in front of us. Because motion is not continuous, the body is actually at one point in one indivisible instant of time, then in the next indivisible part of time, it's in the next indivisible part of space, and so forth. So essentially it's a jerky motion, right? The idea then is that God recreates the universe at every infinitesimal moment, at every discrete smallest part of time. So the object really isn't moving, it's that God recreates the universe in the next moment of time with the object a little further along. Now, with just a little bit of thought, you'll see what the problem with this is. It's entirely contrary to a naturalistic reading of natural philosophy. That is to say, there aren't really natural laws undergirding the behavior of natural objects. It's God's intervention at every discrete, smallest part of time. And so if you have that kind of a notion, well, then you really don't have any science anymore. You don't have scientific laws, unless you're going to assume that God makes up a scientific law that then he abides to in making bodies appear to move. It's an interesting thought, but again, I don't think it can explain everything. In fact, we still know very, very little about the texts written in the later period of the Islamic Empire, after about 1200. And so I think it's probably still a bit premature for us to draw firm conclusions about what happened. In fact, even after the Mongol invasion, after the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258, there seems, even in Mongol-controlled parts of what was the Islamic Empire, important astronomical work is being done suddenly. Or still, I shouldn't say suddenly. It's continuing to go on. So none of these factors are complete, and all of them have problems with them. part of the problem is that the scholarly study of the Islamic Empire often comes to an end with the time that the Latin West starts to awaken. So if you're going to do 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century history of science, you tend to do it in Europe, which means there's a relative vacuum of studies for those periods in the Arabic-speaking world. So all I can tell you is to stay tuned. In the future, hopefully, there will be more scholars of Islamic history of science, and we'll find out a little bit more about the real story. In our next lecture, we then have to move back to the Latin West.